Hi, guys. All right, let's start with Descartes' meditation, the first meditation. What the heck is going on, right? Um, you read this thing and you get the feeling that Descartes thinks he's the only one who's ever had a vivid dream before, right? As though no one prior to the 17th century had ever had a vivid dream and wondered, wow, that was so real, right? So, well, good for you, or good thing for you. Like, this is why I'm here, right? I'm here to help you guys out. I'm here to fill in some gaps and try to sell you on the fact that the guys that we're going to be reading this semester aren't quite as insane as they might initially seem. So, okay, so what is Descartes trying to do here? Well, the first thing I think it's important to remember is that he's writing in a form, this meditation. You shouldn't take it too literally, by which I mean Descartes wasn't actually worried about whether he existed, right? He's not actually thinking that he excuse me, he's not actually thinking that he can doubt his very own existence, right? He's using this as an allegory or a metaphor, right? So now there are parts of it that are true, right? He is worried about being able to establish with certainty, with certitude, certain truths of the world that can then be used as a foundation for knowledge generally. Like, all of that's true. The philosophical stuff is true. I mean, that is to say he really worried about these things. But, he didn't actually, like, sit there. Like, so the meditations are written over a period of, like, 6 different nights. He probably didn't sit in a room by himself for 6 different nights worrying about these things in exactly the way that he's writing about it in the text, right? There he's using like a literary license to try to get the point across in a way that's a little more interesting than just sort of really sort of dryly saying these sorts of philosophical things he's trying to get across. So that's one thing. He's not insane, right? Again, he's not genuinely doubting the existence of the external world or anything. But what he's trying to point out is, hey, look, all of these other things that we've in the past thought were good candidates for the foundations of knowledge, turns out maybe they're not. And so he's using this allegory, this story as just a way of motivating those philosophical concerns in a way that makes it, maybe, or at least he hopes, makes it a little more interesting than just some sort of dry philosophical treatise, right? Leave it up to you to see whether he succeeds in that. Okay. So in this first meditation, excuse me, Descartes really makes more or less 3 basic moves. That is to say, there are 3 arguments or traditional candidates for knowledge that Descartes is going to consider. The traditional candidates for the foundation of knowledge. That is fundamentally what Descartes' program is, by the way. What he really wants to do is to secure knowledge in some sort of foundation, right? So which he wants to be certain, right? He thinks that it needs to be the sort of thing that that reason itself, that anyone using reason in the right way could not possibly deny, right? And he wants to then from there, so from these very basic foundational certain truths, if he can find them, then try to establish from there, like a hierarchy, to try to set forth then, the project of natural science or, things like that. So that's what he's looking for. Now, the first thing, as it were, the first candidate that he looks to as a possibility for the foundation of knowledge is really commonsensical, right? It's going to be sense perception, right? Seems kind of obvious, right? I mean, we tend to, how often do someone says, oh gosh, I don't know, last night, so the Falcons, not last night, the Falcons lost to the Eagles, right, 15-10, right? And you go, well, you've got a skeptical friend that says, how do you know that happened, right? And what would your response be? Well, I saw it. I was watching the game, right, on television, right? So it's so obvious to us that we tend to, like, how do you know something? I was there. I saw it. I heard it. I tasted it. I smelled it. I touched it. That sort of stuff, right? Well, Descartes brings in a couple of problems with this way of thinking. First he says, look, I mean, things seem to change based on all sorts of factors that are arbitrary, right? So, I'm at a distance. I mean, look at, this is actually useful because I'm recording this as a lecture, right? So here, hi, getting real close here. Real sorry about that. And then, ooh, now I'm like way out. Right. No, I'm gonna get close again. Right. Right. It seems like I'm getting bigger, smaller, right? But of course, I'm not actually changing size, right? So Descartes just points that out. That's a problem with, at least with the modality of sight, one of the five senses, obviously, that just something as arbitrary as how close I am to this camera changes the way I appear to you, right? When clearly I'm not growing and shrinking, right? We know that. Or, take an example, so it's frigid out. Take an example, say, if you're waiting for a bus outside. I used to do this when I was in Washington. My daughter and I, we'd have to take the metro every day into Washington from Northern Virginia. And if it's cold out, and you're sitting next to, there are these metal benches you could sit on. Excuse me. And you sit on the metal bench, right? And it feels colder, right? So much so, in fact, that no one in the winter ever wanted to sit on the thing. But the fact is, if it's not sunny out, if the bench isn't wet and the surrounding air is dry or something like that, in other words, if it's just sort of a normal cloudy day, and there's no more moisture on the bench than anywhere else on the ground or whatever, the bench is actually the same exact temperature as the air surrounding it, right? Just because it's metal doesn't make it colder. It's actually the same temperature, but it feels colder, right? It feels so much colder, in fact, that if you sit on it, you will feel as though you're getting colder. You'll shiver more, right? And then you'll want to jump up and not actually want to sit on it, despite the fact that it has to be the same exact temperature as the surrounding air. Right? So these are the sorts of things Descartes got in mind. If we just trusted our sense modalities alone, we might think, holy smokes, Stephen's getting smaller. This is actually really hard to do on this rolly chair. Holy smokes, Stephen just got huge, right? You sit down on a metal bench, you think, man, this thing is way colder than anything else around, touch the outside of your coat, it feels warmer than touching the bench, that sort of stuff. And Descartes just points out, but we know these things aren't true, right? So that's just one of the real basic concerns, right, that he's got. But he's got more, right? So then he spends time on worrying over dreams as well. And look, this is what he's got in mind. When you have a really vivid dream, or a hallucination, if that's your jam, if anyone's ever hallucinated before. I'm not sure that I have. In the moment of the hallucination, in the moment of the dream, you can't make a distinction between whether this is an illusion or whether it's veridical. That's a fancy Latin word, veridical, V-E-R-I, veridical. D-I-C-A-L. Think that's right. I'm a terrible speller. But so you can't tell when you're in the moment whether the experience that you're having is illusory, that is, it doesn't actually correspond with reality outside of your mind. It's something going on in your head. Or whether it's veridical, whether it actually is something that's given to you from outside of your mind, right? So, you can think of any number of experiences like this. I remember this would now be 2 or 3 years ago when my daughter was young. She's still young. She's only 4, but she was like 2 at the time. And I had a dream where she was dying of cancer, and I couldn't save her. And I remember feeling very, very helpless. And in the dream, she kept reaching up and kind of rubbing my cheek and saying, "It's okay, Daddy. It's okay, Daddy." Well, I woke up from that dream like ugly crying. Like it was tears running down, and it was awful, right? And that dream stuck with me for a couple days, actually. It really kind of ruined, it wrecked me for a couple days. Now, think about how amazing that is for a moment, right? The dream was so real, right? At least to me. My mind thought it was so real that I woke up crying. It elicited a physical response within me, unconsciously, right? It's not as though I'm sitting there dreaming and I decide to go, oh wow, well, I think my baby girl might be, deathly ill. That sucks. That makes me very sad. I should cry when I'm sad. Like, we don't do that, right? Like, so far as my mind was concerned, I was undergoing what I can only imagine the worst experience I could possibly ever suffer. God willing, I won't ever have to, right? And it was my own mind, my own body was so convinced of this that it reacted in the very same way we would expect it to react if it happened in reality. Namely, my heart rate, my pulse was quickening, my breath started getting slower like that. I started licking my lips more, and before you know it, when I actually come to consciousness, I was bawling, like just bawling, right? And the reason that was the case is because the experience itself was so real. Now, what Descartes just wants to point out is, look, experiences are just sort of like these mental states that we have. And whether they're illusory or whether they're veridical is indistinguishable from the experience itself. We know nowadays, for instance, that there are certain regions of the brain, because you can do brain surgery while the patient is fully conscious. And there are like regions of the brain where you can like poke a dude and like you'll see a certain color, right? Or poke him in another place and he feels heat or he feels a stinging sensation or something, right? Well, if you like sort of jab a guy in a part of his brain and he feels a heat somewhere, there's nothing about that sensation that says this is the sort of heat that is generated in an inorganic or strange or illusory environment or something. This isn't real heat. This isn't actually caused by a fire out there. Right? There's nothing in the experience that tells you that. It doesn't have a tag on it that says this is an illusion. And then when you feel actual heat, when you're actually sitting by a fire, there's nothing in the experience that has a tag on it that says this is real, right? That's fundamentally what Descartes is trying to suggest here. That the problem, the foundational problem with the sensation as a foundation for knowledge, is that there's no way of determining whether any given sensation, if just upon reflection of the sensation alone, the sensation itself doesn't tell you whether it's illusory or veridical. Now you might object, yeah, but look, after like you had this horrible dream, but then you woke up from the dream, right? And can't you from that sort of infer that that was an illusion as opposed to a veridical experience, right? Well, maybe, right? But right now, at this point in the discussion, or at this point in the meditation, what Descartes wants to point out is, look, there's nothing in the experience itself that tells me that. The reason I know that that was a bad dream is because I woke up from it, right? Upon reflection after the fact, right? But life isn't often like that, right? There's nothing like, I've yet to wake up from the possibility that all of this around me is illusory. It could very well be, I guess. I mean, I don't think it is. But there's nothing, if all I try to do is point to all of my experiences, all Descartes is going to say is, look, I mean, that's a reasonable enough place to stand, but there's nothing about your experience that tells you this is all veridical. There's just nothing there. It could be a dream. It could just be a massive illusion or something like The Matrix, which is why I have you guys watch that video, right? Okay, so that's his primary move against sensation or the five senses as foundation for knowledge. Fundamentally, it just turns out they're not going to cut it, because whether they're illusory or vertical, there's no way in principle of distinguishing between the two when focusing on or considering the sensations themselves. All right, and so the second thing he does is he tries to consider more or less mathematical truths. So he points out, well, look, okay, but even in dreams, so even in cases where something is vertical or illusory, there are certain truths that seem to be unaltered. So if I'm dreaming about a fire, and in one case, and in the other case, I'm actually sitting before a fire, there are some differences there, right? Now, in terms of the experience itself, there's no difference. All of the experiences, the feeling of the heat, the sound of the crackling of the wood and everything, all of that is, for all practical purposes, going to be indistinguishable to me. But there nonetheless are maybe some differences involved. Namely, one is vertical and one is illusory. Just sort of conceptually, right? You can sort of maybe separate these conceptually apart. But there are all sorts of stuff that's going to be the same in them, right? There's going to be color in both. Even if you dream in black and white, which some people do, fine. I mean, you still have shades of gray and black and white, which are colors, right? So there are shapes present in all dreams, right? What would it be like to dream in a shapeless reality or something, right? Where our minds just don't work that way. If you're asleep, 2 plus 2 is still 4, right? If you're awake, 2 plus 2 is still 4, right? So Descartes wondering, well, maybe there are certain sorts of logical truths or mathematical truths or sort of base level conceptual truths, like the reality of the fact, that things exist as expanded in 3 dimensions, right? So all bodies have a certain sort of shape or something like that. So he thinks maybe these are the foundations for knowledge, something like these logical or mathematical truths or something. Maybe we can be sure of them and then see what falls out, what we can deduce from them. This is where Descartes brings in his concern about the evil genius or the malicious demon or whatever your various translations that you guys have picked up. I've offered a suggestion for a translation, but there are tons of translations out there. This is where Descartes brings in that thing, whatever your translator considers it as, the evil genius or the evil demon or something like that. And in the French, by the way, it's malign genie. It looks like malign. The word is exactly like the word in English, malign, and then genie, right? So it can be translated, so malign, evil, or bad, or vicious, and then genie, something like spirit or demon or genius. I don't quite think that quite works. I just think people like to do that, get away from some of the more religious connotations of a demon or something. But anyway, Descartes suggests, well, look, it is the case that I can only think in certain ways, right? My mind isn't going to be able to dream in ways that are too radically different from the various experiences and so forth that I've picked up in my everyday life, right? The mind just seems to work in such a way that it visualizes things, it comprehends things in form or in terms of shape and color and stuff like that. And my mind is just such that regardless of whether I'm awake or asleep, once I know 2 plus 2 is 4, I'm not going to dream some sort of reality whereby I seriously reconsider that as a fundamental truth of mathematics or something like that. Okay. But whether my mind is just sort of forced to believe certain things because of the way it works or whatever, and whether those things are, in point of fact, true are 2 different questions, right? So, just to take an example, someone who is colorblind, say someone who's like truly colorblind. So I actually don't think that this really exists in human beings, but let's suppose it does. Let's suppose that somebody only sees the world in the way that the world appears to us on a black and white screen. So shades of gray, more or less. Somebody who's never had an experience of color before just won't ever dream in Technicolor, right? It's just not going to happen. their brains just don't know how to do that for whatever reason, because the cones in their eyes, at the base of their retinas either aren't there or aren't working or whatever. Then their brains have just never been able to, never been given the relevant details to decipher and sort of form or give the experience of having seen in color, something like that. So you can imagine somebody who's only ever lived in a black and white world, has only ever dreamed in black and white and whatever. Now, to this person, it might seem obvious, right? That, well, look, I mean, when I'm awake and when I'm asleep, at least there are certain things that are the same. However, whack job the illusion or the fact that the peyote I did last night really like tricked me up, or so, and wow, I was high as a kite, and some of that stuff was trippy as anything I'll ever experience. So there's some really weird things that happen in my dreams, and some really weird things happen when I'm really high. But look, here's one thing that all of my dreams and all of my like really whack job highs have, and something that all of my vertical real life experiences have. Hey, look, everything's in black and white. So maybe I can trust that at the very base, reality is at least has some relationship to this black and white experience or something like that. Now, if that were the case, obviously for those of us who don't see only in black and white, we would see why that's a problematic inference, right? We would say, well, yeah, but I mean, look, you see the world the way you see it because there's something going on. There's something that's preventing you from seeing it in a truer way, right? Namely, the cones in your eye and the base of your retinas aren't working, or they're not there, or something like that, right? So, good for you. You're trying to do better philosophy than just what you were doing earlier by only trying to trust your senses or whatever. You've gone a step farther. But we know that there's something wrong with, I mean, you're situated in an incorrect way, and something wrong with the way your eyes and your mind or something are working. That just turns out that that's not the way reality actually is. And that's what Descartes wants to do here, right? He wants to point out, well, maybe, if he's not going to talk about cones at the base of the retina and stuff, they didn't know about those yet. But he's going to say maybe the reason that we tend to think about the world in a certain way, and we can only think about it in certain ways, 2 + 2 is always 4, squares are always squares, and dreams are reality. So geometric principles are the same. Very at the base level, colors and shape and all these things exist both in my dreams and in reality, both when I'm high and in reality. So maybe at the base level, we can root the foundations of our knowledge in something like that, in something like mathematical, geometric principles, something like that. And Descartes just says, well, okay, but just because these things are present and indisputable both in reality and in our dreams, it doesn't follow that they're true. We could be massively mistaken. In the same way that someone who's colorblind always sees black and white is just mistaken through no fault of her own. It's not like she's lazy or whatever. It's just there's something going on that prevents her from seeing reality in as true a way as possible. Right? And we can diagnose the problem. And we know now, like, oh, well, we can say this is why the world appears to you this way, and it just happens not to be veridical, right? There's something keeping you from seeing it as fully or as truly, right? Well, Descartes is saying, what's to keep us from being in a similar position like that? How can we be sure that we're not in a similar position vis-a-vis something like an evil genius? Perhaps we're just under a great deception, right? Now, again, I don't want to make Descartes seem like he's insane. He isn't actually running around worrying about whether we're all being massively deceived. His only point is to show, look, if we're looking for a foundation, a certain foundation of knowledge, it's going to have to be the sort of thing that can withstand all these sorts of critiques, right? It's the sort of thing that's, well, certain, right? So if someone says, yeah, well, what if? And you go, yeah, no, that doesn't cut it. That's fine. It's, in other words, it's broadly speaking, logically impossible that the sorts of things that we're looking for as foundations for knowledge could be countered, that they could be denied, right? In other words, trying to deny them the sorts of things that Descartes looking for are such that an attempt to deny them would basically be like a logical contradiction, or maybe sort of it would an indication that you're insane, something like that. Right? And by insane, I don't mean like just sort of kooky. I mean like you either don't understand what you just said, or like literally your rational faculties have just gone completely crazy, right? So you'd be the sort of person who say, I believe that 2 plus 2 is 5, and I believe 2 means exactly what you believe it means, and plus means exactly what you think it means, and equals means exactly what you think it means, and 5 means exactly what you think it means, and I believe 2 plus 2 equals 5, right? If someone actually said that, you'd be like something's wrong here. Either you don't really understand what you're saying, or like your mind is like addled, like it's like really screwed up, like your computer's broken, right? Those are the sorts of foundational truths Descartes is looking for. And so all he's pointing out with this thing like an evil demon, or a great deceiver or whatever, again, he doesn't really believe that there's one running around out there. His only point is to suggest that, look, it's not irrational. That is to say, it's not a logical contradiction to suppose that all of these things, even things like 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that geometric realities are present both, or geometric concepts are present more or less in the same way in reality as well as in dreams, stuff like that. Just to suggest, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these things are true, right? That doesn't, in other words, it doesn't mean that they're the sorts of things that can serve as a foundation for knowledge. Because someone who's colorblind can say a very similar thing about the way the world looks, both in reality and in dreams. But we know through extenuating circumstances that there's something we understand why she would make that claim, but we also understand that she's mistaken. There's nothing that through reason alone to suggest to us that we're in a different situation. Who knows? Maybe it turns out that we're all being greatly deceived. Maybe it turns out we're all in the Matrix or something like that. So the point is not that he actually thinks that that's happening. So, and I want to stress this just because his philosophical point doesn't rest upon, it doesn't live or die on whether Descartes actually thought we were being greatly deceived. He's just raising it as a general point that it's broadly speaking logically possible. And if it's broadly speaking logically possible, then that means entertaining it isn't a logical contradiction. And if it's not a logical contradiction, then it's not the sort of thing that we can rest assured as a foundation for knowledge, because it can logically and without contradiction, the claim can logically without contradiction be denied, right? So I can just deny the truth of mathematical and geometric reality. That's not to say I can deny that 2 plus 2 is 4, but I can deny that 2 plus 2 is 4 means anything outside of my head, right? It could just be that we're all sort of formulated in such a way as we just think that 2 plus 2 is 4. That's just how the human brain works, and there's no changing it. But that doesn't mean we could maintain that fact that 2 plus 2 is 4. It's just a matter of human psychology, and say nothing about whether it's actually true out there in the cosmos. So we might be incapable of denying it, but have no way of knowing whether it actually is true anywhere other than in human psychology, right? That's the sort of thing that Descartes is just trying to point out here. So whether you want to call it an evil demon or just something like human psychology, look, we just have brains of a certain way that can only develop concepts of a certain sort in certain ways, but that they might not have any bearing on the world outside of the mind, right? And that might sound crazy, but you'll see when we get to Hume, when we get to Kant, that's more or less exactly what Hume and Kant are going to say, right? Descartes doesn't want to go there. Descartes hopes that we can get outside of the mind into external reality. So he's looking for the sorts of truths, the sorts of beliefs that will ground knowledge in such a way that we can be confident both of what we have in our minds, that is, work out the mathematical and logical implications, but also then be able to bridge that gap and say, and this is how I can be sure that these things in my mind are like real, veridical. They correspond meaningfully to the world out there, right? Hume and Kant are more or less going to say that's not really possible, for reasons we'll get into. But right now, and this is where I'll wrap this up. It's been about a half hour. Right now, I just want to kind of finish there. Right, this is where we leave the first meditation. Sense experience can't really be a foundation for knowledge, because on the one hand, it's fickle. In other words, very seemingly arbitrary things affect the way things look or feel, or taste, right? Sometimes you're stuffy, like I'm a little stuffy today. Things taste a little bit different to me when I'm stuffy. Like, those are really arbitrary things, like seemingly small. Stuffy nose, really, it literally affects the way I interact with reality. Whatever is a foundation for truth, it probably should be more stable than that. More to the point, when you're having a vertical experience versus an illusory experience, there's no way of determining in the moment when reflecting upon the experience itself. There's no way of determining whether it's vertical or illusory. Experiences just don't give you that content. They don't just say, hey, I'm an illusory experience, and oh, hey, I'm a vertical experience. They just don't say that to you. And then finally, even things like mathematical or logical truths, the difficulty is that we're not sure whether those truths, even though they're present and indisputable to us, both in dreams and in reality, there's no way of determining whether that is because of the way reality actually is and our mind's ability to interact with reality, or whether it's because there's something going on in our minds whereby we can't think otherwise, but nonetheless, our minds aren't actually corresponding with or graphing onto reality. In the same way that a colorblind person will only see and dream in black and white, and through no fault of her own, she can't help but conceptualize things only in black and white. And yet we know that in reality things are different from the way they seem to her. Descartes is just going to draw that more generally or universally and say maybe human beings have the same sort of problem. All right, hopefully this helps you guys. I'll be doing these, once a week towards the end of the week, because I do want you to work through some of this stuff in your discussions and work through them, yourselves, also with the reading summaries and the focus assignments and all that sort of stuff. Have you turn stuff in and then use these lectures as a way of filling in gaps and as a way of helping you to maybe think on questions that wouldn't have been obvious to you or something like that. So please feel free to go ahead and contact me if you've got any questions. I would recommend writing this or watching this several times and taking notes as well. That way, if something's unclear to you, it'll help you to see whether it's unclear because I didn't do a good job of presenting it, or whether it's because you watched it only once and it was kind of quick. And I cover a lot of material in just over a half hour. So that's it. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend, and I will chat with you later.